Hello. Welcome to another Friday conversation with experts. My name is Mara Koffmann, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Braintrust. We are a platform where parents can connect with certified teachers and learning specialists for private tutoring support. And today I'm here with Alexis Ulaj, who is a principal and English teacher with Uncommon Schools. And I'll pass it over to her so she can introduce herself better than I can. And today we're going to be talking about supporting struggling readers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mara. Just as Mara said, I'm Alexis. Nice to meet everybody virtually. I am in my 5th year in education, and I have really enjoyed this journey. I started off my work in education working with students tutoring, and then I had the opportunity to join Uncommon Schools and be an English teacher. I studied English undergrad, have always been really passionate about language and literature. So it was a really great fit. And now I'm just working on developing teachers to become even better teachers and stronger teachers. And that has been where my passion has kind of shifted. I'm still able to stay in the classroom and still work with children and just continue to develop our children into strong readers and writers and our teachers into strong instructors.
It's wonderful. And as we were discussing before we hopped on this call, like reading is such a foundational, important skill in learning overall. And it's such a crucial thing to develop in kids, on the early side, developing those strong foundational phonics and decoding and fluency skills, and then transitioning on into sort of middle and high school where, you and your instructors focus on most. So in those classrooms, what kind of text do you see students struggling with most?
Yeah, so I think over time, just as curriculum has changed, with the Common Core state standards and just a lot of standardized testing being a huge priority, texts have just become more complex. So there are quite a few factors. What we have found is that providing easier texts doesn't necessarily give students access to like the rich language and schema that they need in order to really engage and be successful in high school and college. So really across genres, there are different types of texts that students struggle with most. We found that genre is a huge factor that adds to the complexity of certain texts that students are exposed to on their grade level. And also, I found that when students lack certain schema and also understanding of vocabulary, these are also large factors that result in students struggling with them the most. So especially in middle school, I've been in the classroom in 6th grade the most. At that age, 11, 12, sometimes 10 years old, if students aren't interested in the text, so if it's nonfiction, a lot of times in those younger grade levels, they're not too interested in reading articles and nonfiction texts. This lack of interest lends to students struggling more. I've also found that if it is on grade level, but it includes a lot of technical vocabulary or, like I said before, schema that students aren't aware of, it's really challenging, regardless of the genre, for them to be able to really unpack the meaning and furthermore, the analysis that's required in order to fully, deeply understand the text.
Yeah. And for those viewers who aren't teachers and don't speak teacher talk, schema has to do with background knowledge around a given topic. So it's sort of the web of connected ideas or experiences or knowledge that you might have about a given topic. And of course, if we don't have that experience and knowledge to bring to a task, if we're reading a book about something that we have no knowledge about, it's gonna be really hard to understand the book. So that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of like having to read Shakespeare or something like that, or Dickens when I was in school, and it feeling so inaccessible, not only because the language and the writing itself is complex, but also like life during these time periods was just so different. And the combination of two things, I think, is like, big time schema, sort of a big picture of schema, because it really makes those texts that much more difficult to access. And so you really have to be a committed reader in order to, put in the time and effort to dig into those books. And so aside from, lacking schema around a topic or, a lack of interest in the general topic, more globally, are there specific parts of texts that you see students have a particularly difficult time with?
Well, I think, again, it's going back to like this idea of vocabulary, right? So if a student's going to read a technical text, a nonfiction technical text with a lot of technical jargon and language, they're going to struggle. I've also found that like in fiction in particular, if there's like multiple conflicts in the story and there's like a particularly dynamic character with, or like multiple protagonists, that makes it really challenging for students to be able to really unpack what the main theme or message that the author's trying to send is. So those are definitely two moments that I've noticed are really challenging. I also think this is something that's so, you briefly touched on this. This is so, seems simple or it seems kind of common sense, but if a student is just like not interested in a text, that's going to really put up a lot of barriers. So we read, for example, just to give you kind of like a little anecdote from our classroom, I used to teach Warriors Don't Cry by Melba Pattillo-Beals. It's such a great book, memoir. But when I introduced it as a memoir, students weren't necessarily immediately interested because they're used to reading like Captain Underpants and Diary of a Wimpy Kid and all of these like fantastical kind of texts. Whereas Warriors Don't Cry, it's nonfiction, but it's a memoir. So you read it as fiction because the theme is trying to be sent to the reader. What I found is that, like, again, going back to the schema piece, giving all the background information and allowing students to really kind of engage with the topics in the book made it a lot easier for them to access it. So like, for example, we had to talk a lot about segregation, integration. We had to make a lot of connections. I work in Newark. So like I was making a lot of connections to Arkansas during that time and Newark during the riots and also even today. So making those connections made it less challenging for students. If a student can't see themselves in what they're reading, it makes it really hard. Kind of like the example that you presented about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
You have zero connection to that. You know that you should read it because it's a classic. You know that you should kind of like it because William Shakespeare is just profound and just this beautiful, wonderful writer and just renowned. But if you aren't able to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the author or the characters in the book, it makes it really hard to be able to engage with it fully and genuinely.
Yeah. And those immersive experiences too, like talking about what was happening in context and those examples you gave. I know when I have worked with students that have to pick up Romeo and Juliet, I always have them watch the Claire Danes, Leonardo DiCaprio version, because that was like, I love Romeo and Juliet after I watched that. But those sorts of resources that help students, really put themselves in the shoes of the people or kind of visualize it in a more complete or sort of multi-sensory way is such a powerful learning tool for accessing all of these complex texts for sure. One of the things that you mentioned is vocabulary, and vocabulary is such an important part of why we need to read, but it can also be such a barrier to understanding what we're reading if you don't have that more advanced vocabulary or knowledge of the words that you're seeing in books. So what are some of the strategies that you use in the classroom to help students with that piece in particular?
Yeah. So in the classroom, this is one of my favorite strategies of all time. I have spent years just trying to kind of like refine it and just make it more sticky for students. And that's vocabulary and context strategies. But before we even do that, we used a lot of annotation strategies. So we have like reading for claim for nonfiction, and we have reading for theme for fiction, which I've touched on a little bit so far. Now for reading with claim, we'll start with that. What we found, or what I found in the classroom, is that, especially for sixth graders, since that's where I've been the most, reading nonfiction texts has been more challenging than reading fiction. just because of the genre. So using reading for claims strategies actually has allowed students to really, instead of kind of just summarizing what they're reading and demonstrating like a really basic surface level literal comprehension of what they're reading, they're able to dive deeply into what the author's agenda or argument, hence claim, or purpose for writing the text is. So for example, this year and in years past, we've had this text in our curriculum for quite some time. Sixth graders read Chew on This by Eric Schlosser and Charles Wilson, which is, it unveils the truth behind the fast food industry, what's really in the food, how the fast food industry manipulates consumers into buying their products. And if you just read it without reading with intention and using those strategies, students might just get the key takeaway that fast food is bad for you. That's pretty much the main thing. But what Schlosser and Wilson are really trying to do is say that it's not just that the fast food is bad, but that the fast food industry is very profitable and they don't want to lose their profits. So they do everything in their power to deceive and manipulate the consumer, children and adults alike, to buy their product. That's a very sophisticated argument for an 11-year-old to arrive at, but these strategies help them get there. So what we do is anytime we read a text like that, which there's not a lot of whole books that are written in nonfiction form until you get older, but texts like that, or articles, for example, which are very, very commonplace nowadays, especially with the media and just like the access to media, we'll have them first identify the topic of the text. So they'll figure out what is this text going to be mostly about so that we can be really targeted as we're reading. They read the title, and sometimes there'll be like a little blurb underneath the title if you're thinking an article, and then the first 1 or 2 paragraphs in order to identify the topic. Then once they've identified the topic, and this is really good for teachers or even parents, because you can really tell a lot if a student's able to understand the topic or not. They're not going to be able to get to the claim if they don't get the topic. So that's where you can kind of push students to understand the general idea or the general, what is this text going to be about, by really honing in on that topic note. Then we have them annotate for the subclaims. So subclaims are the little mini arguments in each section of the text. So if you're thinking an article, you have subtitles with like 2 or 3 paragraphs. A student will write a subclaim at the end of that subtitled section. And they'll keep going as they read the article and just figuring out like, what are the mini arguments that the author is making? Are they doing that through charged language that's like really opinionated? Are they doing that through techniques and rhetorical devices and like literary devices that are like metaphor and simile and all of these different types of techniques that authors use? Are they doing it through that? Then they get to the very end and they identify the overall author's claim. Why did the author write this text? What message is the author trying to send? What is their opinion? What are their thoughts and feelings about this topic that they're talking about? And in order to do that, this is just the most fun thing that I used to do in class. I would say, all right, team, I'm not a math teacher. I'm an English teacher, but I do know a little bit about formulas. So I would say topic plus subclaims equals author's claim. And that was really sticky for students. So what that told them is that they need to go back, read their topic, start off their author's claim with the topic, then go back, read their subclaims, put them all together into like maybe two concise sentences. That's what the whole entire argument is, or claim that the author's trying to make about the topic. So those are kind of like, it's a broad overview of how we ask students to annotate nonfiction texts in order to understand the author's message.
And I think what it highlights, just listening to you describe that, is the fact that what kids need to do as they're reading is process in chunks. So lots of kids will read an entire article, they'll get to the end, and they're like, okay, I did it. And then you say, what's it about? And they really can't tell you that much about what it's about. They might remember the last thing that they read, but they don't really remember the beginning or the middle. And with that process of going through the article or the book in these explicit pieces and making sure that students are stopping to think, reflect, process, and synthesize those ideas in pieces as they go, it not only ensures that they will have a better understanding of each section of the text that they read, but they'll be better positioned to actually identify those claims, synthesize the ideas, and write something about what they wrote at the end of it, which is ultimately what every single one of these assignments adds up to. And so many kids forget about that piece of the fact that every single English assignment that they have, they're going to have to write something about it. And the key to writing about what you read is having those sort of annotations and those ideas really clearly mapped out. So it sounds like that's reinforced all the time in the classroom. And it's really great to hear that, because it's going to build good executive function skills, and it's going to build good reading comprehension skills, which will also help them become better writers too.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you touch on that. I also think what you said is really profound, Mara, because we talked a little bit even before this live about how we help build confidence in our readers. So a lot of the kids that I've worked with, they come in, we've talked about this too, is like lacking the foundational skills. But if they can, like you said, chunk these pieces of a really rigorous text and kind of get affirmation from a parent or a teacher or a tutor or whoever it is that's working through it with them, then they feel more confident to continue moving on. And a lot of times the reason why they say they read this whole article and I don't understand it is because they're overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. It's not that they can't do it, but there's just a lot of information and they don't know how to process it all. So I think like this is an amazing way in which to empower students and children to feel confident about being capable and able to process these texts, and then, like you said, down the line, write about it at some point, because that's part of it.
Well, and I think it's also, as if we talk about it as adults and kind of model that process, that when we read, this is what we do. It's not just this thing that you have to do because you're in 5th grade or you're in 6th grade or you're in 8th grade or 9th grade. This is what you do as a good reader, is you read these small chunks of a text and then you make sure that you understand it before you continue on to the next section of text. And it's not necessarily always putting in those Post-its, and it's not necessarily annotating in the same way. But that's reading comprehension, and that's making sure that you understand what you're reading, which is the whole point of reading, right? It's understanding the text and following the story or following the argument so that you're able to immerse yourself in the book or in the article, whatever it happens to be. So that conversation is an important one to have, I think, around all of these topics as well. And tell us about vocabulary, because that's the other important piece.
Yes. And before vocabulary, I just want to touch on fiction as well, because that's the same thing as it really is just what you said about chunking it for fiction too. So it's when we're thinking about fiction passages, like I said before, students tend to like them more. They tend to immerse themselves more because they like the characters and they can kind of connect with them. And we try to pick texts in which our students can relate to so that they can build this passion and love for literature, especially at a young age, because down the line, that's going to help them. But we teach students to read for theme. So again, theme is the overall universal lesson that you can learn about the world through a character going through a conflict, a change, a resolution over the course of a plot. And this is pretty straightforward. I feel like even when I was in school, I did something along these lines, not so much with nonfiction, but I feel like this was kind of the way that English was taught for fiction, even many moons ago. But I think, like you said before, annotating in this way allows students to kind of chunk the plot, right? Mm-hmm. So like you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let me first understand what the beginning is. That's going to be the main conflict that the protagonist is going through. How is the protagonist characterized throughout this conflict? Maybe they're scared. Maybe they're curious. Maybe they're ignorant. Maybe all of these different types of characterization and traits that they start off with. Then we can identify, okay, this student has, or this child has understood the conflict. Let's move on to the change. Mm-hmm. Where's the moment in which the character is starting to kind of change their perspective on the situation that they're in, particularly the conflict? Then the resolution obviously is that nice ending, sometimes not so nice ending to the story where the protagonist learns something. Mm-hmm. And it's profound, and that's the message that the author wants you to walk away with as the reader. So I think it's a little easier to teach this, and it's more fun and engaging. But like you said, just the overall kind of takeaway for fiction strategies is chunking, I think, the same way as we do for nonfiction, so that they can really work through the plot and then feel confident, even if they're introduced to some like really dynamic characters who are like throwing a wrench into things, they can unpack who's the one that they need to be paying attention to.
Yeah. And there's that roller coaster visual or mountain sometimes that I think is so helpful in terms of framing and visualizing plot for kids. And the fact that most stories will follow that arc helps to create that sort of reading with intention and being able to predict and look for these events within a text. That again helps to create sort of like a schema for understanding things and for identifying those chunks in terms of the events as they're progressing through the book, and how characters are changing as a result of those events, because that's the other big thing that they have to read for.
Right, exactly. So now, without further ado, my favorite strategy to teach in English ever is vocabulary and context. So I always get made fun of, which is, it's interesting that I get made fun for this, but by my family, that I use all of these big words that nobody understands. So I just love to make sure that my kids also do the same. And I think complex texts obviously have rigorous and unfamiliar vocabulary words that prevent them from understanding what they're reading. And like we were talking about earlier, a lot of times kids will just gloss over those words, but the deeper you get into a text, the more words there are, or the more frequently the same words are being used. And then before you know it, they're in a hole where they don't understand anything that they're reading. It's a bunch of gibberish. So we teach students how to determine the meaning of a word by using the context around the word to predict its meaning. So I have like about 8 steps that I kind of walk students through, and we practice this every single day in school. And I am not exaggerating here. When I used to teach 6th grade English, every day we would do this, and it was the best part of my day because I loved it so much. So the first thing they would do is we would, obviously they would find the word. Sometimes we would just do like an excerpt of something, or if it's inside of the text, they do it directly inside of their books. They would have to circle and cross off the unknown word to force themselves to make a prediction. So this is like, ding, ding, ding. This word, I don't know what it means. I could easily go over it, but I'm not going to, because I'm circling it and I'm crossing it off. So that was the one piece hurdle that we're getting over here. Second is that they needed to figure out, and this was the like missing piece of the formula for this strategy that I spent a long time trying to really figure out, if like, what is missing to make this work more often than not. And that's determining what the word is describing, if it's an adjective, or determining what the word could possibly be if it's a noun. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a prediction, sort of, if it's a noun, but if it's an adjective, which oftentimes it's the adjectives that are the most challenging, they would write down what that word is describing. So if it was describing a noun, they would write down the noun that it's describing. Then this is another piece that's so important. It's determining the connotation of the word, because a lot of times, especially on standardized tests, testing anywhere, the trap answers give you the opposite connotation. And if you didn't understand what the connotation was, then you're going to pick the trap. So they had to determine if it's positive or it's negative. And they would do that just by rereading the paragraph and looking at the notes that they had written down so far next to the word and labeling it. I think this was like a huge piece, because sometimes, again, they forget. I made them put like a little plus sign, a little minus sign, going back to math. They were confused. They're like, why is Mrs. Ulaj doing math in English? But we would, that's what I would be monitoring for in class. And then before they even, again, the goal for this is not only, they obviously have to understand what the word means, but we would think about the end goal in which they have to answer questions about it, right? So after they have determined the connotation, usually they're able to eliminate 1 or 2 answer choices out of 4. And that made them, again, really confident, because they're like, yes, I just crossed off 2 negatively connoted words, and this is positive. So now I have a 50-50 chance of getting this right. So it helped a lot of students who lack those foundational skills that made it rigorous vocabulary even more challenging to unpack. Then they would go back to the paragraph, find all the context clues around the unknown words. So they figure out like what other words are being used similarly, what other words are being used the same way in the paragraph or the paragraph above, and I'd have them box all of them. So they would circle or box all of the other words in the paragraph that sound like they're being used the same way as the unknown word. Then they'd put together those notes, the connotation, the description, the context clue, and they'd make a prediction. They'd come up with a word that they already know. That sometimes it's not just a word, sometimes it'll be a phrase, because again, it's like you got to think of what you have to work with.
Right.
And then they'd write their little prediction down, and then they'd select an answer that best matches their prediction. They wouldn't finalize their answer quite yet because they have to plug it in. So then what they would do is, does this word that I think it is make sense in this sentence? If it didn't, then they needed to go back to the drawing board and figure out where they kind of like, made the error. But if it makes sense, if they're able to plug in that prediction back into the paragraph or back into the sentence, and logically it makes sense, then they're able to really more further understand. And what I always did just to solidify their understanding is at the end of whatever paragraph the word was in, I'd have them write down like the theme or the claim now, like a revised one. Did that strategy help you better understand what the theme or the claim was? And 9 times out of 10, it did. So again, that's how I kind of connected the vocabulary and context strategy to like understanding the message that the authors are trying to send in a fiction and nonfiction text.
Yeah, well, and I think the strategy brings 2 things to mind. One is that when you're connecting it to the author's intention, it's highlighting the fact that authors choose words with intention, and the words that they choose have a purpose and a meaning. And that's why it's important to learn them. It's not just for the sake of like answering that one question, but this is a really good word because the author chose this word so intentionally. But it also, everything that you described very much works to create schema around remembering that word, and going through that process as opposed to just looking up a definition is a very different experience. And creating that rich kind of strategic approach to figuring out the meaning of a word is going to help so much more with creating schema, which is going to promote retention so much more than just writing down the definition or simply looking up the definition, reading it over, and then continuing to read the book. So I think that sounds like a really valuable strategy. And I hope that you also see that students are applying that and sort of generalizing that into their reading outside of these more structured vocabulary and context type exercises, but sort of realizing that this is something that will help them become a better reader, not just in the context of this moment when you're testing their ability to do it, but more so as they encounter these types of words in texts that they're reading either personally or for science or for history, because the whole purpose of learning all of these words is to become a better reader, right? And we have to read for so many different purposes. So for all of those reasons, being able to enrich your vocabulary and understand how to tackle words with confidence is a gift to be able to teach kids.
Absolutely. And I think too, like you touched on a couple really key things here. The in 5th and 6th grade, these lower grade levels where we were talking earlier about like having kids build the habit early so that as they get older, it becomes more automatic. That when the students are in 7th and 8th grade, they're just doing it naturally. And the nice thing too about particularly this strategy, again, we were talking about as well, like making this something that will give students confidence and kind of like, yes, I was able to figure this out because this is a habit that I'm doing every single day and it's paying off. And now I'm able to figure this out. And like you said, we want them to be able to have investment in that habit so that they can do it when they don't have to, technically, right? Yeah. When they're taking a test, when they're in English class, when they're anywhere else outside or outside of the classroom. So it's been really nice because we've had when I taught 6th grade, we would launch vocabulary and context in other content areas. So I remember one of the history teacher was like, Mrs. Ulaj, I need to use vocabulary and context in history class because we're exposing kids to really rigorous texts and they still don't know how to do it. And that was telling me like, oh, wait, this habit has not been established. I need to do this every day. And not only that, but we also need to do it in history class. Yeah. So the kids are getting invested in this. And now I see 8th and 9th graders that I taught a couple of years ago, 10th graders that I taught a few years ago, they're just doing it automatically, and they're able to figure it out, and they're able to read these robust, complex, and really high lexile level texts that they probably wouldn't have thought in 6th grade they would ever be reading. But I think like using these types of strategies, they seem rote right now, especially when I describe them, but they build the automaticity that they're going to need when they're just reading article on their computer about the inauguration, or they're reading, I'm reading The Vanishing Half, and I still use this type of strategy in my brain. I don't write down the X's and the checks and the pluses and the minuses, but I do it in my head because I know I'm an adult, and I still find words that I don't know the meaning to. Yeah. So that's the goal long term.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing these strategies. And I will take this recording and put it into a blog post so that we can really lay them out very clearly. So I'll be sure to send you a link to that too. And our viewers can find it on the website, which is www.braintrusttutors.com, with 2 T's right next to each other in the middle. And thank you again, Alexis, for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was so awesome. And I hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.